Darkcast Network. Welcome to the dark side of podcasts.
There are times when it feels like Mother Nature is sending a warning to the human race, captivating them in her brutality as she sings a warning that we cannot continue to do what we are doing. By 1910, railroads were finally connecting the West Coast to the East Coast in North America. The rail owners felt proud of their accomplishments and how they battled to win the fight for the land against Mother Nature. But it was in a short window of time that Mother Nature showed her hand, a hand that held all the cards and claimed the lives of hundreds of men. As tons of snow came barreling down at the mountainsides, those standing in the wake had little time to respond. The snow encapsulated them, freezing them in their last moments of time, disintegrating machinery in the process, ripping the railroad from the ground, and in a period of days, a multi-million-dollar decision was made. Mother Nature fought and won, but it was at the mercy of the men who were buried in her frigid depths. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. Hello and welcome back. I am your host, Kayla, and a few housekeeping things as usual to start us off. First, I'm like 8 or 9 shirt purchases, I guess, away from kind of my first goal when it comes to merch. So if you are looking at anything, go ahead and grab that. I will be getting it out to you as soon as I possibly can, and you're helping me reach that goal. Also, keeping in mind that I know that that is a goal that I have no control over. I can't force anyone to buy something. It's just, fun to play that little game of like, ooh, am I gonna get there or am I not? And it's really completely out of my control. Second, I want to welcome Brett to Patreon. Thank you so much for joining us. And then last, before we get into this episode, I want to say that, in this podcast, we talk about death quite a bit. And something that I realized with the kind of expected loss of my own grandfather this last week, something that I realized is that we should not be waiting until people are on their deathbeds to tell them the things that we want them to know. We should be doing that while they're alive and well and able to absorb and contemplate what it is we have to tell them. So, just keep that in mind. If you have something that you want to tell someone, if you appreciate anything about them, I highly encourage you to do that, whether it's in person or through a note or through a text or email. Just tell the people you love that you love them. Moving on. The winter of 1910 slammed into the northern Rockies with a vengeance. As storms rolled out from the Gulf of Alaska and hurtled over the mountain range, blizzards dumped snow in some areas, dumping a foot of snow a day. Then the winter turned, warming slightly, creating just enough heat to melt some of the snow. The top layers became heavy and would eventually give way to the slightest rattle of the earth. The combination created a deadly effect, especially for those who were stuck on the single railroad tracks that wove through the area. When the Great Northern Railroad finally pressed through the Cascade Mountain Range in the state of Washington and connected the rest of the United States with the West Coast, men and women both felt a sense of pride and fascination that they had finally conquered nature and the once impassable mountains. The Great Northern Railroad had originally planned to build switchback routes over the mountains, but they figured out pretty quickly that in order to maintain the railroad, doing this would require significant stations that they did not want to have to employ long term. So instead, they decided to tunnel through the mountains. In order for this to happen, railroad communities were established in 1893 so that the railway workers and their families would have some nearby homes while working extensively on the railroad. The labor was extremely hard and tempers were often high with the sweltering heat that occurred as they tunneled through the mountains. The Cascade Range is known to be one of the hardest ranges for the railroad to cross, claiming an uncountable number of lives due to the ice and snow that covered the steep cliffs, narrow passageways, and eventually explosive debris coming from deep within the base of the mountains. When Wellington, Washington was established, they would take on a project of creating 2 tunnels, one being a 2.5-mile or 4-kilometer tunnel, which was created in 1900, and the other being the 8-mile or 13 kilometers that would eventually replace the need to go over Stevens Pass. These 2 tunnels form the Cascade Tunnel, which is a tunnel that is still used today. But while work was being done on these tunnels, Stevens Pass was used for traveling over the range. But the winters came with treacherous routes and constant delays. Stevens Pass is a mountain pass through the Cascade Mountains located at the border of King County and Chelan County in Washington, United States. Today, U.S. Route 2 travels over the pass, reaching a maximum elevation of 4,061 feet or 1,238 meters. The roads today are carved into the landscape of steep inclines and blinding switchbacks, and a dense wall of greens and white triangular peaks greet viewers from far and near. But a century ago, the ground looked very different. Stevens Pass contains part of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest on the western side of its ridge and the Wenatchee National Forest on the eastern side. But before the forest could be established, trains grate through the area. The sparks from the might of the engines pulling loads up steep inclines caused fires. So many, in fact, that men had sole jobs of following the trains to put out any fires that they ignited. But this was a difficult job to keep up with. The dry 1909 season gave way to a massive fires that could spread without hindrance. What trees hadn't been cut down for logging were at risk for fire, and Stevens Pass was no exception. The foliage you expected to see here was rather sparse, and instead a blanket of white snow covered the ground and continued to fall from the sky. On February 24, 1910, 2 trains from the Great Northern Railroad became stuck on the tracks when the snow became too deep for them to continue pushing forward. One train, the Fast Mail Train number 27, was coming from Leavenworth, Washington, and the other, the Spokane Local Passenger Train number 25, was coming from Spokane, Washington, both heading for the West Coast. On these trains were families, railroad workers, and mail workers. Combined, there were 5 or 6 engines and 15 boxcars, passenger cars, and sleeper cars. They were forced to stop just outside of Cascade Tunnel on the eastern side of the Cascade Range. In an attempt to quickly free these 2 trains and send them on their way, 4 rotary plows were launched. Rotary plows are a train engine with what looks like a giant fan on the front of it. The rotating blades collect the snow from the track and then shoot the snow out the side, similarly to a snowblower. However, things just did not go to plan this winter. These 2 trains would end up being stuck here for 6 days, where Windy Mountain's base gave way to a ledge above Tie Creek. On February 25th, one of the rotary plows hit a stump, resulting in damage so extensive that the plow was removed from the tracks for repair. On the 27th, the second plow became stuck and then ran out of fuel as it tried to get free. Then the last 2 plows became stuck when they were caught in a small avalanche. Because it is not just snow that comes down the mountainside, but rocks and debris, there was concern that using the plows to get the engines free would result in damage to the plow blades. So instead, workers were sent to dig out these rotary plows by hand. To amplify matters, the men who were sent to dig out the rotary plows were hired specifically for this process. The Great Northern Railroad knew that avalanches were a common part of being in the mountains, and so they prepared for this by hiring snow shovelers. But the workers were angry. They felt that the job had not been accurately portrayed to them, and therefore they were not being appropriately paid for their work. The Mountain Division supervisor in early February became frustrated with the constant complaints and started firing anyone who did not like what they were being paid to shovel snow. Within 2 weeks, this was almost all of their hired shovelers. Days at this point had passed, with the 2 trains being stuck on the tracks, completely unable to move. The area had been hammered by storm after storm, and then during the night on March 1st, 1910, another storm swept through the area. It unleashed feet of snow, lightning, thunder, and then, like a grand finale, an avalanche broke free from the slopes of Windy Mountain and barreled down the side. There was an eerie howling sound punctuated by grinding and snapping. It was unlike anything that anyone had ever heard before. It was unlike any devastation that anyone was about to witness. Due to a lack of understanding at the time, fires and deforestation had stripped the lands away from Windy Mountain and the surrounding area. The slopes had to be cleared of what was left after a train engine ignited a fire, and the slopes were never replanted. The result was a deadly effect of a massive slab avalanche letting loose. And with nothing to anchor it or slow it down, the slab grew in size until it was a half-mile wide. Both trains were picked up by the avalanche and carried over the edge of a cliff and down 150 feet or 45 meters to the bottom of a ravine. But the devastation doesn't stop there. Massive amounts of snow followed the trains, burying them in some places 40 to 70 feet or 12 to 21 meters deep. There was one witness to the avalanche. Charles Andrews had stepped away from the train to do something, and when he was on his way back, he heard the distinct sound of what we would come to know as an avalanche. He saw it as it rushed closer, picking up the trains like they were toys and carrying them over the ledge. In all, 96 lives were lost in the devastation of the Wellington Avalanche. 61 of those lives were railway employees and 35 were passengers. Of the 23 that survived, all of them had critical injuries. Even with Charles witnessing the disaster as it unfolded in front of him, it still took 6 hours to locate the train cars beneath the snow. The railroad then decided to do what they could to recover the bodies of those who perished, while also maintaining the route through Stevens Pass. But then someone high up in the Great Northern Railroad Company decided that digging out the dead was not a worthwhile task when they could just wait for the snow to melt. This means that the final person was not found until July, 21 weeks after the avalanche struck. The bodies of the victims were piled up and removed like logs of wood on toboggans, and the disrespect of the passengers and workers came to a head when the track was repaired and back up and running within 3 weeks of the avalanche. Today, Wellington, which is also known as Thai, is a haunted location that many have had experiences that raise the hairs on the back of their necks. But Wellington was not alone in this tragedy. Just days later, a second avalanche would occur 400 miles or 640 kilometers away at Rodger Pass in the Selkirk Mountains of British Columbia.
Hi, my name is Mallory Jenner Robinson. Join me on A Hateful Homicide, a true crime and investigative journalism podcast dedicated to telling the stories regarding the murders and hate crimes of our transgender, non-binary, intersex, and two-spirit community members in the United States and abroad. This is A Hateful Homicide.
Much like the Great Northern Railroad, the Canada Pacific Railroad successfully built a track through the Selkirk Mountains, which connected the western coast to the rest of Canada when the line was laid in 1885. They carefully wove the rail line through the mountains and in doing so brought it over the passes that they thought would allow for easiest travel. What they didn't know was that Rodger Pass was a deadly stretch between ridges, and they would soon learn why. Rodger Pass is located in the Canadian Glacier National Park, and the park safety team regularly monitors the pass due to its frequent avalanches. Today, the safety team works in conjunction with the Canadian Forces Artillery, but only to protect the Trans-Canada Highway that now winds through the area. While the deep and powdery snow provides some of the best skiing or snowboarding options in the area, the terrain is often unstable and avalanche safety courses are highly recommended and sometimes required in order to receive a permit that you must have in order to recreate in the area. But the frequent avalanches do bring some good things for the animals that live here. For example, research projects have found that grizzly bears depend on avalanches so that once the spring thaw comes, the flower bulbs are available for them to easily dig up and consume. The more gruesome side to this is that animals inevitably get caught in slides and they become fair game for scavengers as well. The closest town, at least in 1910, was Revelstoke, and this town was the main hub for employees to work on the Transcontinental Railway. At the time, this was the only link connecting the west coast to the mid and eastern coast of Canada, and much like Stevens Pass, Rodger Pass was dumped on by snow over and over, and men would have to be hired to dig out the tracks to allow for trains to pass. Many of the workers were immigrants coming from Japan, England, Ireland, Scotland, Sweden, Denmark, and Ukraine. Having been completed in November of 1885, the tracks were abandoned and then repaired that first winter due to avalanches burying the tracks under 39 feet or 12 meters of snow and ripping away a section of the track. To try to combat this, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company installed 31 snow sheds that were meant to protect the most vulnerable sections of the tracks from avalanches. The snow sheds are essentially a wooden tunnel that is built into the mountainside with a slanted roof, with the idea being that the snow would flow over the tracks instead of colliding with or burying the tracks altogether. These 31 sheds covered a total of 4 miles or 6.5 kilometers, and as you can imagine, this still meant that much of the track through the pass was exposed, especially when you consider that the tracks that cut through the pass was 46 miles or 74 kilometers in length. Maybe the sheds did help, but it is hard to tell. Since the opening in 1886, almost 150 people had died in avalanches in the area in the 26 years it had been in operation. But it was an expensive operation. The cost to build this route through the pass and the snow sheds to protect them was nearly 1.5 million Canadian dollars. Today, that is equivalent to almost $51 million. On March 4th at 5:40 p.m., 3 days after the Wellington disaster, an avalanche swept down Cheops Mountain and buried the track just outside of shed number 17 near Bear Creek. A crew was sent out to clean off the tracks as Canadian Pacific Railroad train number 97 just was entering the Rocky Mountains on its way to Vancouver. It was carrying 400 passengers, so to the company, it was vital that the track was cleared before the train got there so that way there would be no delay. A team of 63 men and a rotary plow were deployed, and they worked quickly and effectively. While they worked, it continued to snow. But as temperatures warmed slightly, the snow gave way to sleet and then rain. They were working inside of what would be kind of like a man-made crevasse of wood and snow, and they nearly had the tracks clear when, at about 11:30 p.m., just shy of 6 hours after the first avalanche, a crack echoed through the cold night air. Then a rumble was felt, and before anyone could react, the avalanche that had ripped away from the opposite ridge on Avalanche Mountain struck the men who were almost able to head off to bed. The avalanche buried a quarter mile or 400 meters of the track, and the 91-ton rotary plow was picked up and tossed 50 feet or 15 meters onto the closest snow shed, forcing it to land upside down. The other cars behind the engine were crushed to bits, and then the area was covered in 32 feet or 10 meters of snow, rock, trees, and other debris. Billy LaChance, who was the plow's fireman, had stepped away from the working area, and as the avalanche descended on the area, the blast of wind that preceded the snow struck him and blew him off his feet. It actually tossed him so far that he was free from the wreckage. For many years, it was believed that he was the sole survivor of the avalanche, but recent studies have found that 3 others survived. The confusion came, though, due to the fact that many of the workers were Japanese and did not speak the same language, which means that for a time, many couldn't understand when they said that they had survived the avalanche. The discovery was found by looking through old company employment records and comparing the hours they worked and the pay they received, showing that 3 of the men continued to log hours and receive paychecks after they had been sent to clear the tracks when the avalanche struck. Another survivor was John Anderson, who was a section manager who stepped away to call what I will call headquarters to give them an update and say that the slide was almost clear. When he returned to the site, though, devastation was left in its wake. It wasn't until the next day, March 5th, that news reached Revelstoke about the avalanche, and in response, 200 railway workers, physicians, and nurses were sent to the scene to find and help survivors. But they quickly realized that the attempt was futile. There were no survivors. Instead, their work shifted to recovering the dead and clearing the tracks of snow. As we have mentioned in other episodes, avalanche snow warms up just enough due to the friction of it coming down the mountain that it becomes a liquid-like state. As it slows and comes to a rest, it is very quickly cooling and sets like concrete. Due to this, many of those buried in this avalanche were found as if they were still working. One man actually had his hands holding a pipe up to his mouth like he was trying to light it, and others had cigarettes still in their mouths. It took a total of 7 weeks to finally recover the last body buried in the snow. The Canadian Pacific Railroad took this as a sign that they could not keep doing what they were doing. In combination with the avalanches, mudslides, and fires that burned down some of their snow sheds, they had too much to contend with. In 1913, they began work to tunnel through Mount McDonald so that they could bypass the devastation that Rodger Pass would, without a doubt, continue. On December 13, 1916, 3 years and 5 miles, or 9 kilometers later, the Connaught Tunnel was opened. The tunnel ended up costing the railroad company $9.2 million Canadian dollars, with $2.5 million spent on dynamite alone. Today, those numbers would look like $305 million and $68 million. During the storm period, 9 avalanches fell in the northern Rocky Mountains. The devastation was felt like a ripple, not just to the families that lost their loved ones. Communities felt the impact as a massive white matter stole away numerous families to their deaths, depression, and having to learn how to live again while grieving those they loved. Nearly 180 people died through the 9 slides, though the 58 lost at Rodger Pass and the 96 lost at Stevens Pass were the biggest casualties in a single event. Today, these still stand as some of the most devastating avalanches in both the United States and Canada. And while it is hard to contemplate, it is worth remembering. Ignoring history is how historic events repeat themselves. The early 1900s was a time of change, where people and those in power fought against mega companies looking to strip the land for all it had. Deforestation and logging had a direct impact on these events. Forest fires that the government refused to allow adequate help for amplified the effects. And in the end, the greed of keeping the rail line open during blizzards so that way they could make $1 in freight doomed these workers and passengers. There is not a light at the end of the tunnel here, so to speak. There is, however, the opportunity to respect nature using the knowledge we have gained and step into a role where we can do something to prevent these disasters from happening again. Thank you for listening. We'll talk again next week. Bye. What is life without close calls with disaster? Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow the podcast to be the first to hear the now weekly episodes. Join our subscription on Patreon, Apple, or Spotify today and immerse yourself in the haunting beauty of the great outdoors. For around $4 a month, you'll get exclusive access to the first episode of each month and early access to all other episodes, showcasing the morbid and mysterious side of nature. Please reach out with story requests, and if you have your own story, please email tragedywithaview@gmail.com for a chance to have your story featured on a later episode. Again, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.